Massimo Pigliucci is a philosopher at City University in New York, and as a public intellectual, he maintains a popular blog, Rationally Speaking. Truth is a concept that permeates all our lives, but is it a monolithic concept? Often not. How should we think about truth and the different theories of truth?
I think we need to be clear, first of all, that truth actually is has different meanings depending on what area of human knowledge or human endeavor we apply it to. For instance, a scientific truth, I think, as a concept, is something very different from, let's say, a mathematical truth or a logical truth. Scientific truths are by nature usually provisional. They are arrived at inductively, using empirical evidence, that sort of things. On the other hand, a mathematical truth or a logical truth is usually arrived at deductively. It's once arrived at, that's it, you're done. Once that you know that the Pythagorean theorem is true, there is no way it's ever going to be false. It's not provisional in that sense. So those are at least in those areas those are very different concepts of truth. And then, of course, if we get to things like aesthetic truths or moral truths, then clearly we're talking about something, again, yet another beast. I don't think there is such a thing as aesthetic truth. There are aesthetic judgments which do make sense within certain cultural contexts, but I don't think that rise to the level of truth. There may be such a thing as moral truth, but not in the sense, in anything like the sort of the scientific sense or even the mathematical sense. I mean, I think that moral truths are better thought of as conclusions that one arrives at based on reasoning on about our values, where they come from, what is it that we value or not value, and for what reasons. So we can have agreement on what we call moral truths, but certainly it's got nothing like a scientific truth or a logical truth. So we need to separate different meanings of the word truth, because otherwise a lot of confusion ensues. If you're thinking of scientific truth and you're talking about morality, then you're talking apples and oranges.
Sure, clearly it's not a monolithic concept. Just to clarify some of those points there and just get to expand in some different areas. Of course, most would agree that morality is a subjective analysis of a situation, usually arrived at by conclusions, as you said, by argumentation and rationality. Obviously, morals are pluralistic historically, and we can see that across the world today. Logical truths, quite clearly, 2 and 2 is not 5. A dead man is not alive. Scientific truth, though, is a very interesting area. Most practice aspects of philosophy of science know that it's inductive, provisional. We can't, by definition, always know an absolute truth in scientific inquiry, mainly because it's built on theoretical propositions that are based on empirical data. But of course, this can all change. But importantly, with this in science, and this is an area that you've got expertise in particularly, and I know it's your future work and your book. How does this fundamentally tie in with progress and truth? Can we ever make progress towards a truth in science? This is very problematic, isn't it?
It is problematic. I mean, it's certainly more problematic than most practicing scientists probably would think. But then again, that's they're not epistemologists, so it's not really their job to worry too much about that. I think it is the concept of scientific truth is in fact a little bit problematic, not in any way that would give comfort to, let's say, an extreme postmodernist or a creationist or whatever it is. I do think that science demonstrably does make progress. It's the problem is that it's much more difficult than one may think at first to give an account for how actually that progress occurs. So first of all, let me back up for a second here about something that I said a minute ago, which is I said that scientific truths are arrived at inductively and that they're typically provisional. But I should be more careful there. That's true for scientific theories. And to some extent is true for some notions in science that we think of it as factual. But there are certain notions in science that are pretty much established, and I don't think we're going to go back on it. For instance, the fact that the sun is a star, at this point, that's as solid a fact as you can possibly imagine. I mean, yes, you can take the sort of the radical skeptic perspective and say, well, there's no way to have any sure knowledge of anything. Fine. That is true. We can bracket that and ignore it for a moment, and for all in fact, for more than a moment, for all practical reasons, we can ignore that. But saved for radical skepticism, there are certain notions about science and certain facts that science has arrived at that are pretty much as well established as anything you can think of. But those are not the interesting ones. The interesting ones are the notions that science is currently working on, the stuff that is at the frontier, especially scientific theorizing. Those clearly are in fact provisional. I mean, Newtonian theory turned out to be wrong, replaced by general relativity. Well, now we know that general relativity is either wrong or incomplete, but it is less wrong than Newtonian mechanics, which of course brings us to your question, which is, well, less wrong in what sense? And there are several different accounts for how science makes progress. And you mentioned the book that I'm working on. That's a book on how philosophy actually makes progress that I'm writing for University of Chicago Press. But as part of that project, in the book, I explore the concept of progress in other fields, and particularly in science and in mathematics, because I think that those are good models for thinking about progress in philosophy, and yet they're distinct enough. I don't make in the book. I'm not making the argument that philosophy makes progress in the same sense in which science, or in fact even math, make progress. But I think that one needs some kind of idea of how other fields make progress in order to say, well, does philosophy itself make progress, and so how? So doing my research, I'm a philosopher of science, and doing my research for the book on progress in science, it turns out that there's a number of accounts. You can use what is called the functionalist account. These are people like Thomas Kuhn, for instance, or more recently Larry Loden, who essentially say they are anti-realists about scientific theories, meaning that they claim that there is no way to know whether scientific theories refer to a world in a sort of in a true sense. What all we can know is that they work, that they're empirically adequate. In other words, they're not. These are not people who deny that there is a world out there. They just say that there's no way for us to know whether our theories actually describe that world as it truly is or not. Now, they have a point. I'm not an anti-realist myself. I'm not a functionalist in that sense myself. But they have a point. And in fact, the point is well illustrated by the transition that I mentioned a minute ago between Newtonian mechanics and general relativity. So as it turns out, Newtonian mechanics is in fact wrong. I mean, it gives us the wrong description of space and time. For Newton, space and time were fixed. The universe is a sort of a model of a billiard ball table. There are things happening, but the space itself is fixed. Einstein, on the other hand, tells us that space-time, first of all, that time is a different aspect of the same basic thing of which space is part, so they're not distinct. And also space-time is, in fact, flexible, changeable. So those are very different views of things, right? And from Einstein's perspective, Newton was, in fact, wrong about the basic nature of the physical world. And yet, if you want to shoot a cannonball or send a probe to Mars, you better use Newtonian mechanics, because relativistic calculations are too complicated. You just can't do them well enough and quickly enough. And Newtonian mechanics is, functionally works very well. You will get the cannonball where you want it to land, and you will get the probe to Mars. So the question, of course, so functionalists seem to have a point there, right? They're saying, look, we do know of situations where a theory, according to scientists themselves, turned out to be wrong, but in fact it is empirically adequate for a certain period of time. So, how do you know that the current theory that scientists tell you is correct isn't going to turn out to be exactly the same situation? In fact, it turns out it's going to be wrong, but it's functionally or empirically adequate. So that's one way of looking at it. I don't particularly buy into it. I think it's an interesting way to look at it, and it raises interesting questions about truth about progress in science. I do think that a better way of looking at it is that science does make progress in the sense that it arrives closer and closer to the truth. So this is an account that is sometimes cashed out in terms of verisimilitude or truth likeness. Right? So these are people who suggest that Popper was one of the first ones to articulate this view of science, is that it's not that Newton was wrong and then Einstein is going to also turn out to be wrong and so on and so forth. It's that Newton was wrong, yes, but Einstein is going to turn out to be wrong, but less wrong than Newton. Now, the question is, of course, how do you, so in other words, Einstein's theory is closer to the truth. Now, the question is, how do you cash that one out? Because in order to say that a theory is closer to the truth, it seems like you would have to know already what the truth is. How do you measure the distance from an object that you don't know what it is, right? And that's an interesting objection. I don't think, and many philosophers of science don't think it's a fatal objection at all. There is all sorts of stuff that we don't see and yet we can measure. So, for instance, before turning to philosophy of science, I was an evolutionary biologist, and part of my empirical work was to measure natural selection, and in particular, in order to measure natural selection both in the lab and in the field, you have to have estimates of fitness, because by definition, natural selection is whatever change in a population increases the fitness of that population to a particular environment. Well, you can't measure fitness directly. There's no way. Fitness is a hypothetical construct, and it's what social scientists call a latent variable. There is no direct access to it. What you can do, however, is you can measure things that you think are correlated with fitness. So these are proxies, basically. And again, that's both what ecologists and evolutionary biologists and, in fact, social scientists do all the time. And you measure these proxies, and then you can estimate the value or the position of the hidden variable, the latent variable. I think some philosophers of science have defended a similar account of truth-likeness. That is, you don't need to know exactly where the truth is. What you need to do is to have available a certain number of instruments that indirectly estimate the distance between your current hypothesis and the truth. And scientists, I think, would agree. I think that a physicist would tell you, well, we do have those instruments, and one of those instruments is the idea that Einstein's relativity explains everything that Newtonian mechanics explained, and then some. And so we think we're getting closer to the truth, whatever that is, simply because the new theory is actually inclusive of the old one. It's not that we have discarded this stuff because it wasn't working. Is you can actually derive Newtonian mechanics as an approximation from general relativity.
Sure. Well, good to see that you came to your senses. Used to be a scientist and now you're a philosopher. That's good to see.
That was my midlife crisis, yes.
That's good to see. But some of the points you touched upon there, if we've got time, I might go back to some of the differences into the social and natural sciences. But at this moment in time, it's what you were saying there in terms of, okay, can we get at this absolute truth and progress through science, or are we just kind of chipping away better aspects of reality and not necessarily discarding the old theories, but kind of bring them in inclusively to another area? So, okay, aspects of Newtonian physics are no longer applicable, but some of them aspects are still applicable and empirically adequate, and that's why we can incorporate them in with Einstein's theory of relativity. Having said that, how would you play with this in terms of what the role of facts are doing here and the potential consequences of paradigm shifts? So someone obviously like Kuhn would say that there are two different paradigms operating here, therefore there are two different theories that are painting two different realities. You've just said why that's not necessarily the case, and many would agree with that. But then how do we treat these facts that are changing from aspects of Newtonian mechanics to Einstein's theory of relativity? Is this an issue? And if so, what does this say about the constitution of facts themselves?
Yeah, those are all excellent questions. Now, I'm assuming we have a couple of hours to go, right? We'll do our best. We'll do our best. Okay, so no, those are very good questions. Now, Kuhn himself was notoriously sort of ambivalent about exactly what he was after, because he's claimed both by the realist and the anti-realist in philosophy of science, which is kind of weird because they're very different positions. And even more so interesting is the fact that Kuhn is actually claimed both by philosophers of science, who tend to be, by and large, pretty sympathetic to science as an epistemic enterprise. I mean, philosophers of science have a lot of respect for science, arguably more so than scientists have for philosophy of science. But But Kuhn is also claimed by postmodernists, by people who actually reject science as a privileged way of learning about the world. So it's kind of weird. And Kuhn himself was aware of this problem. We know he knew, and we understand pretty well where the problem was coming from. And Kuhn later in his career wrote, in fact, a long postscript to the structure of scientific revolution, tried to sort of clarify his view and distance himself from the sort of postmodernist interpretation, and to some extent from the structuralist interpretation, the anti-realist interpretation. Now, whether he succeeded or not, I'm not sure. But basically, here's the problem. When Kuhn introduced the idea of paradigm shift, let's say going from the Newtonian paradigm to the relativistic paradigm, or from Ptolemaic astronomy to Copernican astronomy, and so on and so forth. He used a number of metaphors, and one of these analogies turned out to be very unfortunate, because it immediately captivated the imagination of people. People really understood what was going on there, but unfortunately, it was leading them in the wrong conclusion. So the analogy that Kuhn came up with was with Gestalt images in psychology. So these are the famous, you've seen them, I'm sure. These are the famous images where you look at the thing, and if you look at it in one way, it looks like a rabbit. If you look at it in the way, it looks like something completely different, or an old woman versus a young woman, or a vase with two faces, that sort of stuff. Now, clearly, so what Kuhn was saying is, look, that's what a paradigm switch feels like. You were looking at the face of the old woman, and then all of a sudden you have a different way of looking at the same exact information. Nothing has changed on the page. The image is exactly the same, and yet now you see the young woman. So the young woman is a different interpretation. It's a different paradigm of exactly the same facts on the ground. Now, why is this problematic? It really does give you a very good feeling for what Kuhn was saying, but it's problematic because, of course, there is no true interpretation of a Gestalt image. When you switch from the old woman to the young woman in the Gestalt image, you're not seeing a better truth. You're not getting closer to the truth. You just the two interpretations are exactly the same. In fact, they're both arbitrary because there is no woman there. There's just a bunch of scribbles on the paper. So this was problematic because the postmodernist wing sort of philosophy sort of run with it and say, see, what Kuhn actually meant was that there is no truth out there. It's all about how you look at things. That is not what Kuhn meant, and by his own words, it clearly is not what he meant. And yet that image, that analogy, really captured people's imagination. So I think that is a cautionary tale about using analogies. Unfortunately, they can be too convincing. Now, back to your question. So, in what sense can we make then sense of the idea that, let's say, a move from the Newtonian paradigm to the relativistic paradigm is in fact progress? So, and what is the role of facts in this thing? Well, philosophers of science pretty much agree at this point, I think, that there is no such thing as facts out there, independent of any theoretical construct. In fact, famously, it was Darwin who articulated this notion. I think it was one of the very early people who articulated this notion. He wrote in a apparently very frustrated letter to a friend that he couldn't understand how it's possible that some people think that facts are independent of theories. That is, facts make sense only within a particular theory. Otherwise, there is an infinite number of bits of information out there that it's unstructured. The way we structure the world, the way we understand the world, is in fact by deploying theories, by deploying paradigms. So that means that the facts don't, this idea that unfortunately a lot of scientists still have, that sort of facts are out there and are independent, and your theory, you confront the theory with the facts, and then the facts determine whether the theory is right or wrong. That's too simplistic. It just doesn't work that way, because what counts as a fact or what doesn't count as a fact actually depends on the theory you're talking about, you're trying to test. So that said, again, it seems pretty clear from the history of physics, at least, that we do have a better, more comprehensive, more experimentally sound, better backed up by data, etc., view when we move from of the universe when we move from the Newtonian paradigm to the relativistic paradigm. So in that sense, we're making progress. However, there is such a thing as a Kuhn loss, and which occasionally happens in the move in the shift from one paradigm to another. So a Kuhn loss is defined as something that you thought you understood under the old paradigm, and yet now you don't anymore. That it doesn't make any sense in the new paradigm. There are cases of Kuhn losses apparently in the history of science. So there are some things that just don't make much sense or have been abandoned or put aside from during the move from one paradigm to another. But they're not that many. It's in fact it's actually pretty hard to come up with solid examples of that. I can think of a few examples in, let's say, developmental biology when it went when it went molecular, basically. So there's a lot of information that was accumulated, a lot of interesting hypotheses that were accumulated by developmental biologists in the first part of the 20th century, and a bunch of that stuff is actually being cast aside because there's no easy way to make it fit with the current molecular-based approach to developmental biology. So there are some examples of Kuhn losses. And of course, one should be worried about Kuhn losses because they may indicate some kind of regress in science, right? At least a partial regress. You got a new paradigm, you got new stuff going on, but it turns out you're paying a price because you're losing some of the things that you thought you knew before. But this is not something that we should be wasting too much sleep over, because first of all, as I said, Kuhn losses seem to be rare, and second of all, because nobody's ever argued, I think, that scientific progress is sort of a linear ascendance toward truth. I mean, science works in complicated ways, and sometimes we do run into dead ends. Sometimes we have to go back and revisit certain notions. I think that the idea that science makes progress is only sort of overall over long periods of time. And in fact, we probably should be distinguishing between progress in different subdisciplines of science. So for instance, there are long periods of time where ecology hasn't made progress, as in decades, where more facts were accumulated, but there was no breakthrough sort of theoretically. Physics itself, it's in a very strange situation. If you ask Lee Smolin, for instance, a physicist who authored a few years ago The Trouble with Physics, he will tell you that the last 30 years have been a waste for physics, because it's the first time since at least in the last 150 years that physics has not had a theoretical breakthrough that was accompanied by an empirical backing up of that breakthrough. I'm talking, of course, about string theory.
Yes.
So one does need to be worried about those kind of things. But that becomes worrisome only if one adopts a very simplistic, linear march toward the truth, no mistakes made kind of thing in science. That's clearly not the case. I mean, the history of science doesn't bear that out.
They're all great, interesting points there. And if we've got time at the end, we'll get to string theory, because that's obviously very salient in terms of realism and theoretical entities that have no empirical observation as of yet. But just to pull up some things that you said that was great, the way you explained how we can think of facts in these different ways. So a fact that's never independent of a theory, or at least a theoretical framework, is an issue that contemporary scientists today, I know Darwin and Einstein to a certain extent were slightly more pensive with the subject, but a lot of scientists have this problem, especially with materialism, that they always want to assert that a fact is independent of a theory. Now, for example, if there are paradigms that are going to change and we can think about assimilating a fact in a different way, space-time, which under Einsteinian relativity is one fact in itself, later down the line this fact could change into something else while still incorporating something that was similar to space-time. Now, this brings me on to this issue of fact-value distinction that's been obviously prominent throughout philosophy, and it had another resurgence with the critical theory school of Frankfurt in the early half of the 20th century. But what I want to focus on now is some of the distinctions between the natural and the social sciences when we deal with truth. Now, of course, you're aware of postmodernism, post-structuralism, and most people today don't have, it doesn't have as much sway as it used to. But if we take someone like Foucault, who emphasized that truth and reality in the social sciences and the humanities are constructed. And again, that would lend itself to us discussing morality or justice. Okay, we can see that these are values that people want to pin down as some kind of truth that may not necessarily be true, but then we run into problems if you want to apply this to material aspects of empirical verification in science. So for you, Massimo, how can we deal with these different assertions of facts in the social and natural sciences? Do they have to be kept distinct, or can we at least try to make a convergence of the two? How do you feel about this?
Okay, yeah, those again, very good questions. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. So first of all, the question, I would agree with the basic postmodernist claim, or the certain the Foucaultian claim, that in some sense the subject matters of the social sciences are in fact constructed. But we need to be careful about constructing what sense. I mean, there's this famous book that by Ian Acking, I think, that came out a few years ago. Was called The Social Construction of What, and that's he was asking precisely that question. And it's like, let's be careful about what we mean exactly by social construction, because at the one end, especially, let's talk about it first in sort of the what I think it's the easier framework, which is actually that of the natural sciences, and then we'll move to the social sciences, because I think the postmodernists have a much stronger case to build in the social sciences than the natural sciences, but unfortunately they sort of spilled over into natural sciences to a degree that made some of them look foolish. So let's talk about the natural sciences first. Well, now you can take two extremes of the claim that the theories and notions of the natural sciences are socially constructed. On the one hand, you can say, well, the natural sciences are a human epistemic activity, and so in that sense, anything that a scientist says is socially constructed because it's done by a human being within a particular, social, economic, historical, cultural, and so on framework. Well, that's true, but that is trivially true. In that sense, anything we do is socially constructed, no question about it. Now, you can go to the opposite extreme and say, no. What I mean was the strong version of it, of the social construction claim, which is that there is no sense in which we can correspond, or we can even attempt to make scientific notions correspond to truth. They're arbitrary. They're socially constructed in the sense that your opinion is just as good as mine. Well, there the response is the one that some very frustrating natural sciences do give, and is along the lines of, oh, if you think that the gravitation, the concept of gravity is socially constructed, why don't you just jump out the window from the 20th floor? Hopefully, there will be fewer silly philosophers around after you do the experiment. So now, I find neither one of those extremes particularly interesting, because if the postmodernists mean either one of those, then there is nothing there to be said, because the first claim is trivially true, the second one is obviously and ridiculously wrong. So in order to be charitable, which this is one of the things that I learned when I moved from science to philosophy, and that I love, this concept that you really ought to be charitable to your opponents. In order to be charitable, then I'm assuming that we're talking about some more sophisticated concept of social construction that lies somewhere in the middle. Now, in the natural sciences, that's actually fairly easy to cash out, because what we have there is that scientific theories, of course, are social constructs in the very significant sense that they do depend, historically and culturally on the particular moment. I mean, there are some theories that were probably not possible. They couldn't have been produced at certain historical times because the cultural conditions were not there. The history of science had not developed up to a certain point, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, scientific theories are in fact socially constructed in an interesting sense, a sense in which the historian of science, and to some extent even the sociologist of science, can contribute understanding. But at the same time, they're not, they're socially constructed, yes, but they're clearly very strongly constrained by the way the world actually is. You can come up with all sorts of theories you want, but in the end, if they're either going to work or they're not going to work, and that's going to be determined in great part by the way the world is. Now, Move to the social sciences and things become more complicated. Why? Well, because we build also much of the world itself. When we're talking about psychology, sociology, economics, and so on and so forth, those things are theories in those areas are constrained to some extent by the way the world is. But the way the world is itself largely, not exclusively, I think, not entirely, but largely socially constructed. Take the case of economics, for instance. I mean, some economists do talk, at least, I don't know what they think, but they talk as if the laws of the markets were similar to the law of gravity, but they're not, because markets are artificial entities. There's no such a thing as a natural market. Markets are human inventions. So yes, once you invented this thing, it will have a certain predictable behaviors, certain patterns will emerge, and so on and so forth. But the analogy there is not with the natural world. It's not with, there's planets out there and I'm going to discover them. It's more with things like chess. Chess is a human invention. That doesn't mean there are no predictable patterns. I mean, if you understand the game of chess, you know very well what's going to happen, and you can play it much more efficiently than other people. But it is socially constructed in the very strong sense that chess simply doesn't exist out there independent of human beings. So the social sciences have this really tough, are in this really tough situation where it's not just that their theories are socially constructed in the sense of being the result of human epistemic efforts, but the constraints imposed by the world on those theories themselves are largely socially constructed, and that's, I think, what makes the social sciences particularly open to the criticism, to the postmodern criticism. I think, however, up to a certain point, even there, it's not that you can ignore. It's not that there are no constraints from the natural world in turn, because human cultural evolution is an interesting field in and of itself, but it is in fact rooted on biological evolution in turn. So let me give an example. You mentioned briefly the distinction between fact and values, which typically is brought up in ethics, in moral theory. Now, if there is anything that is socially constructed, it would seem that's morality, that's ethics, and to some extent that's true. But the fact that it's socially constructed doesn't mean it's entirely independent of the way things are out there. In particular, it's not independent of certain things about human nature. I mean, human beings are a certain kind of animals. For one thing, we're social animals. If we were not social animals, we probably wouldn't even have a concept of morality. Right? So, and there are certain things that most functional, meaning non-psychopathic human beings want. We all want security. We all want relations with other people. We all want to be able to pursue our projects, individual projects, whatever those are. So those things are essentially human universals, and they're essentially based, at least to some extent, they're rooted in the biology, in what it means to be a human being, as opposed to what it means to be a termite. Termites they're incapable of personal projects. Right. So in that sense, even the social sciences and even ethics itself, I think, is constrained to a degree by the natural sciences, but to a much less degree than of course things like biology, chemistry, or physics are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that would be agreed upon by most people. So to make your point there about the social sciences being socially constructed in terms of values, concepts and labels, it's still obviously restrained materially by science. So of course we can debate what gender is, but we can't debate what sex and male is, etc. A lot of the problems here seems to be this riddle that accompanies both the natural and the social sciences. So of course the natural sciences face less constraints because of aspects of materialism and how they verify their data. The social sciences, okay, they can play with quantifications as econometricians do and sociologists do, but at the same time they're still hampered by the fact that they are constructing these conceptual labels that are then being quantified in regression models, etc. Now the natural sciences, most people would see a great point that you made there is, okay, you don't believe in gravity, jump out the window. You don't believe in this, I'd like to see you survive on a plane. Now, the riddle that comes into that is this whole thing that you've been alluding to the whole way through this discussion, which is, okay, yeah, we've got aspects of materialism, we can empirically verify this, and we can set this up with our facts and our theories. But even with this materialistic empirical verification, we're always trapped with this issue of what is this fact and what is this theory, and that's always an issue that natural science can't escape. With this kind of aspects in mind, let's just wrap some of this up by talking about big problem that's faced today by physics, which is string theory, a great theoretical framework that explains a lot. It has a lot of explanatory power. The only problem is we can't think of, as of yet, any way to empirically test this. How do you feel about this? What does this say about the realist debate? Is it reinvigorating the anti-realist debate, or can we get around this?
That is another excellent question. So it's, I'll leave the details of course, of debating string theory to the physicists, where it really belongs. What I'm interested in is, what does it say philosophically about physics and the current status of physics, and more broadly, actually, about the current status of science. So the basic idea is what you just said. That is, there's this great theory that's been around now since, in one form or another, since the 1980s. And at the moment, up to now, there is not a single new novel, and that's a crucial point. And there's not a single novel empirical result that was predicted by the theory and by nothing else that has actually been verified. I mean, the theory has been used to demonstrate that it makes a lot of postdictions. Postdictions are things that we already know, and the theory can explain them. But of course, postdictions are not particularly convincing, because the theories we already have also explain those facts. The test of a theory is, does it predict things that we don't know, and then we find out, and it turns out that the theory that's very strong support for the theory. So string theory hasn't done that so far. This is not because physicists are intellectually deficient or anything like that. It's because string theory deals with things that are, in fact, at the moment beyond the technological limits of what we can do. I mean, we're talking about very, very, very high energy physics, and we just don't seem to be able, at the moment at least, and possibly for a long time to come, to produce that sort of conditions in the laboratory situation, so that we can test crucial aspects of the theory. But it's worse than that, actually. I mean, that's bad enough, because now what that means is that, as Liz Mullin, that I mentioned before, says, now what that means is we got a theory, there is a dominant theory in fundamental physics that for decades has not been tested, and we seem not to have any particularly good prospect of testing in the near future. So, you might start wondering, well, in what sense is that a scientific theory? I mean, it's a very interesting, very sophisticated mathematical construct, but is it really describing the way the world is, or not? I mean, that's what science is about. Science is not just mathematics. It's about, the major difference between mathematics and science, in fact, I would say, is precisely that mathematics describes these possible worlds, these theoretical constructs, and then physics describes the subset of those worlds that actually matches with our real world. So right now, string theory is physics-informed mathematics, but not really physics. So that's bad enough. But actually, as I said, it gets worse, because string theories are now talking about, or fundamental physicists are now talking about the fact that it's not really appropriate to refer to string theory as a theory. It's actually a family of theories, because there's a bunch of parameters that describe the theory, and those parameters can combine to yield a bunch of different sub-theories, basically, within the general landscape. They actually refer to as a landscape of string theories. And that landscape apparently is very, very large. I think that I've heard somewhere the number 10 to the 500 possible sub-theories. That's a lot of theories. That's a one followed up by 500 zeros. Now, if that is the case, then we're in serious trouble, because if the problem were simply that, well, we got one theory, we don't know how to test it right now, but hopefully we will. Okay, we can wait, we can work on that. But if we have 10 to the 500 theories, or whatever the actual number is, it doesn't matter. If we have a very high number of theories, then one can seriously argue that there is no way, even in principle, we're going to ever be able to discriminate among those, because there's just not going to be enough data to discriminate among that kind of variety of theories. I mean, to give you an example, a much more humble example, I still remember a very well-known population genetic theorist a number of years ago, who at a congress, at a meeting, was saying that, give me 4 variables and I can simulate whatever the hell you want. Meaning that he had enough degrees of freedom with a model based on just 4 variables that he could basically adapt any kind of data possible. This is not good, because it means that, right, it means that the data grossly underdetermine the theory, essentially. So in the case of string theory, that's to the nth power. It's the same problem to the nth power. Now, at this point, my understanding is that the physics community then split into 2. There's a minority position, which is represented, among other people, by Lee Smolin, who says, you know what, that means that there's something fundamentally wrong about the theory. If we're going to a complex mathematical landscape that has no hope whatsoever of ever being tested empirically, then we're doing something wrong. We should go back to the drawing board and think about something else, and try to work out an alternative to this. Right now, he's in the minority. The majority of physicists apparently are sort of inclined in biting the bullet and say, well, you know what? It turns out that we got to a point where we find out that the reality is, in fact, potentially described by this very, very high number of theories, by this landscape. And so it turns out that, that's what science tells us. And you just have to, just because you don't like it sort of aesthetically, it's not pleasing or whatever it is, who cares? That's the reality, and that's where we're going to be for the foreseeable future. It's going to be interesting, because from the point of view of a philosopher of science, this is a really, physics is at the crossroads. It's really interesting. It could change dramatically its own nature and sort of revisit its own aims. If it turns out that the aim of fundamental physics may no longer be to find the theory of everything, as Steven Weinberg famously referred to a decade ago. It may be that there is no way in principle. The physics itself tells us that there is no way in principle for us to arrive at a theory of everything. Or maybe the current generation of physicists is, in fact, off the right track, and Smolin is right, and we need to go back and do something else.
They're all very, very interesting points. I think it's quite funny how some physicists in this field would say, oh, this may not be logically or aesthetically pleasing for you in terms of validating this theory, but just take that and you're going to have to deal with that. Again, you'd like to see a bit more training in philosophy of science for some of those people. But that aside, I mean, one aspect of it is very complex, that the mathematics, just in the figures it produces, is very complex. Testing it is extremely difficult, if not impossible. One aspect of it would see if they could perhaps increase its predictive power, but then again, they're going to have to use it to predict something. What are they going to predict? That's another aspect of it. Another aspect of this, just to make the point, is obviously the multiverse hypothesis, which is again very hard to empirically verify and observe. I was speaking to this with Victor J. Stenger last week, and apparently this is completely out of my realm and my jurisdiction, but some physicists believe that by looking at aspects of the cosmic background radiation, that we could perhaps see dents in that from other universes. That's all I know. That's according to Victor J. Stenger. I'd take that on a reasonable good word. Now,
well, actually, I read that paper. I know what he's talking about, and it is very interesting. I mean, there appeared to be a signature in the background radiation that shows an asymmetry at the very large scale in the universe, an asymmetry that shouldn't really be there. And one possible interpretation is that asymmetry was caused by an early collision with another universe. That's fascinating. But the rub here is that actually there are already other 2 or 3 hypotheses out there that could explain the asymmetry without actually invoking the parallel universe. So, never say never. In science, you never say never. It's just because people can't figure out a way now of doing something, that doesn't mean, of course, they will never figure it out. But it certainly is the case that whenever we're talking about 10 to the 500 string theories or multiverses and things like that, those are in fact currently impossible to test, and they may be impossible forever to test, in which case you sort of wonder, well, what are we left with? It's an interesting mathematical speculation. It has roots in actual physics, because these things, these people don't just come up with the stuff from whole cloth, but they clearly fall short of of something, the status like of something like quantum mechanics. And speaking of quantum mechanics, if you don't mind, just 1 minute about it. One of the things that it's interesting about physics is that even a very, very well established and very, very well empirically supported theory like quantum mechanics, it's actually very interesting from a philosophical perspective, because, as you know, there are different interpretations of what quantum mechanics means, right? So there's the Copenhagen interpretation, there is the many worlds interpretation, there's 3 or 4 out there. And, well, as soon as you start talking about interpretation, you're not doing science anymore. You already moved into philosophy of science, because those interpretations are all equally compatible with the data. The data aren't going to tell you. In fact, the very fact that physicists are talking about interpreting something, a theory, it's interesting in and of itself, because, like, what do you mean interpretation? I thought that the scientific theory was a scientific theory. Period. I don't need to interpret the theory of the Darwinian theory of evolution, for instance. I don't need to interpret Newtonian mechanics. That they are what they are. Period. That's what they give me a picture of, respectively, evolutionary biology and mechanics, and that's it. There's no interpretation needed. When you start talking about interpretation, you're moving away from physics, or at the very least, you're at the borderline between physics and philosophy of physics, which I find fascinating. I think it's very interesting. Now, I met a few years ago a physicist who had an attitude of a different kind, which apparently is somewhat widespread in the community, and that is referred to as the shut up and calculate school. And the shut up and calculate school basically says, look, I don't want to even be bothered with interpreting quantum mechanics. All I want to do is, I know the equations, I know exactly what the equations are telling me, and I can use those equations to make predictions about empirical phenomena. In other words, you shut up and calculate. And it was interesting. This was during a panel discussion at NYU, New York University, and there were a couple of other physicists on the stage and a philosopher of physics. And the other 2 physicists said pretty vehemently that, no, that's not enough. That's not what science is about. Science is not about just shutting up and calculate. Science is about finding the truth about the natural world. So we want to know what the theory means. We want an interpretation of the theory. We don't just want to use the equations to calculate empirical results. And I find that's a fascinating debate, because it really goes at the core of what is science? What is it that we're doing here? What's the goal? Is the goal just to calculate? And in other words, as the anti-realists would say, is the goal just empirical adequacy? That's certainly one of the goals. I mean, you don't have a good scientific theory unless it is also empirically adequate. But do we really want to say that science itself is limited to being empirically adequate? It doesn't really tell you anything about how the world really is. I think not, but it's an interesting debate that apparently physicists themselves are having.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely fascinating. Actually, we might hopefully in the future see a move to different professions, if not at least double doctorates. I'd like to see some physicists getting a PhD in philosophy of science. But as you say, it goes to the heart of what the scientific practice is historically and in the modern world, and as you've been alluding to all the way through, how is it that these things tie in with truth and theories? Now, Massimo, just moving forward, what are some of the future areas in general that will be studied in truth? Where do you see this going in terms of philosophical research, your work, the work of your colleagues who are in this field? What's next on the horizon for you and the area of truth in research?
That's an interesting question about epistemology. My specific field is not epistemology. I'm interested in truth insofar as it helped me figure out things like progress in science, and as opposed to, say, lack of progress in pseudoscience. I mean, a book that I just co-edited with Martin Baudry at University of Ghent, and that is coming out, as it turns out, very shortly, in a couple of weeks. It's The Philosophy of Pseudoscience for Chicago Press, and that book is a collection of essays about the demarcation problem and that sort of stuff. And you cannot talk about that unless you talk about epistemology, unless you talk about concepts of truth. So I come to this from a different perspective, not a purely epistemological perspective. I find interesting, for instance, the discussion of the relationship between truth and knowledge, as well as truth and justification. So as you know, the standard definition of knowledge ever since Plato is justified true belief, right? But of course, Gautier a number of years ago, and back in the 60s, raised some interesting counterexamples that seem to be showing that now actually there are situations where you seem to have justified true belief, and yet you probably wouldn't call whatever it is that you have knowledge. So that has led to a sort of a cottage industry of responses and counter responses to Gautier style problems. And actually, I looked into this very recently, again, as part of the project for the book that I'm running on progress in philosophy. I think that the debate about Gautier-style problems actually is one of the best examples I know recently of progress in philosophy, because it explores different positions, different sort of different positions in conceptual space, in logical space, and then it finds exceptions and then counter exceptions and so on. And that you make progress by realizing that your original position was actually too simple, and then it needs to be more sophisticated. And there are different ways of making it more sophisticated. There are different ways of responding to Gautier, and those different ways bring you in different areas of conceptual space within epistemology. So I think that some of the work that is going to be interesting to look at, however, is the move from considerations of knowledge and even truth itself to consideration of issues of epistemic warrant. Of course, so justification basically. How do you justify certain claims? Now, there's already a ton of work that's been done, of course, in that field, and this is not nothing that it's at the beginning. But I think that that is one of the areas where I've seen a lot of interesting work coming out recently, and I'm betting that in the future there's going to be some interesting stuff coming out. This also has very direct applications to science, especially to controversial areas of science. For instance, just to give you an example, there's been recently a pushback from some philosophers as well as some neuroscientists to this onslaught of fMRI scan based claims about what the human brain does and how it works, right? So there's all this work that's based on functional magnetic resonance imaging of the brain, and people have come up with all sorts of claims like, oh, the fMRI scans show that really are biological differences between men and women, for instance, in the brain, or that this is your brain on morality, this is your brain on blah blah blah, and some of this work has initially been greeted with almost uncritical acceptance. Oh, the neurobiologists finally discovered the neural correlate of free will, or whatever the claim was. And then eventually, sort of some philosophers started looking at it and said, "Well, wait a minute. What do you mean? What exactly? What is your justification for those claims? How does the evidence actually match to the claim itself? And what theoretical basis do you have? It gets really interesting and very complicated. And the reason this is interesting is not just because it's an application of epistemology and sort of philosophy of science to ongoing science, but because the science in question actually makes a statement that are socially relevant. If you buy into the idea, for instance, that there are fundamental biological differences between men and women in their brains, or that your brain does certain things when you think about morality that it doesn't do when you think about mathematics, or so on and so forth, there are consequences. If neurobiologists claim that they discover, let's say, that there is no free will, that's a big deal. And they have, by the way, a few of them. I think they're mistaken, but I don't think they can actually say anything at all about free will. But that's a different discussion. Yeah, exactly. In great part, it does depend on how you define it. And of course, most neurobiologists are not philosophically sophisticated. This is not their fault. That's not their discipline. It does become a fault, however, when they take on concepts such as morality, let's say, or free will, that are inherently philosophical concepts without apparently being aware that they're stepping into a minefield of other stuff. So those are some of the areas where I think sort of applied epistemology of that kind, at the borderline between philosophy of science and science practice, I think it's going to be very interesting to look at in the next foreseeable future.
What's the book title for Progress in Philosophy? When can we expect that out?
The provisional title is Does Philosophy Make Progress? Which I intend to be a rhetorical question, because my answer is going to be yes, although with caveats and all that. The manuscript is due to the editor at Chicago Press sometime in January. Then, of course, it has to go out for review, etc. So I'm hoping that it's going to be available in bookstores by the end of 2014, possibly very, very early on in 2015. But in the meantime, as I said, the philosophy of pseudoscience is coming out in a couple of weeks.